Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with part 2 of this 3-part video series on this 1/16 scale radio-controlled M4A3 Sherman tank. If you're stumbling into this video for the first time, I first want to say welcome, and the second thing I want to point out is that this video here is the second installment of a 3-part video series discussing this model. Part 1 of this series, I go over the base starter model as well as the condition that it arrived in, and in this video here, we'll be going over exclusively the amount of details and other modifications that went into the model, bringing it up to the condition that you see it here. In the third installment, we'll be taking this model out for a test run where you get to see this model in action. But before I do that, I just want to point out that this model here is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and or purchase. If anyone is interested, I do take on commission build work from models ranging between 1/35 scale and 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that information would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. Now with all that out of the way, let's crack into this video. To start this video off, let's take a quick walk around this model. And this vehicle here is of a vehicle that needs hardly any introduction. This is the late production variant of the M4A3 Sherman tank. And in my humble opinion, when it comes to 75mm gun equipped Shermans, this pattern here is that vehicle's design at its apex. Now, if anyone was ever wondering exactly why the hell are there so many different variants and incarnations of this one particular vehicle design, well, hopefully this will give you a glimmer onto why that's the case. This pattern of Sherman here was a relatively latecomer to the scene. Although the vehicles themselves were in production from 1942 onward, this pattern of vehicle entered into production around 1943 or 1944. The vehicles that preceded it utilized a different construction method for the hulls. They were either made from a single all-cast piece, like what is seen on the M4A1, or they were comprised of several components made from either rolled or cast components that were then assembled via jigs, welded together, giving you a mosaic type assembly that would give you the upper hull. Although the two previous manufacturing techniques were more than capable of outputting the numbers required for the war effort, it was deemed that it could be simplified and made even more efficient by changing the design. The engineers at Ford were able to take the overall basic dimensions and redesign them. Rather than using a mosaic format to comprise the front glacis plate for the armored hull, the Ford engineers utilized a single panel of rolled steel. To do this, the front angle of the vehicle was changed, but by doing this, more interior space was also allocated, which was one of the problems that was mentioned on the other vehicles when they were in field. The new hull still utilized cast components, only rather than 2 or 3 components that needed to be jigged together, there was only one large component which consisted of the hatch well area, and another component which was a smaller plug which would have contained the equipment for mounting of the bow M1919A4 machine gun. With this new hull design, this allowed crews better access to enter and exit the vehicle with a lot more ease. This was one of the requests given from feedback from the troops from the front lines. Another crucial development that was incorporated into this new hull design was the wet ammunition storage. The other variants of this vehicle that came before it stowed their ammunition in dry ammunition racks. Why this is important and relevant is because if the vehicle gets hit and the armor gets penetrated, the wet ammunition reduces the risk of the ammunition catching fire, which can lead to catastrophic destruction of the vehicle and the crew. Aside from the hull configuration changes, the other most significant aspect of this vehicle was the engine and the power pack. Prior to this, the Sherman utilized a smattering of different engines in order to propel the vehicle. From the original radial engine, which was a good engine, but because of the high demand of the aircraft industry, there was going to be some difficulty in outputting enough engines to suit both of the demands. Because of that, the military needed to literally and figuratively change gears to find a way in order to give the vehicles enough power that they needed to propel, but also do in a way that wouldn't harm the war effort. In addition to that, these engines needed to also have been very reliable and very easy to work on in field. Because of these specifications, or the desire to find a new power plant, was when the industry started coming up with different solutions, each of them with their own ideas. GM would utilize a dual diesel engine concept, which was to be utilized on the M4A2 and also the M10 tank destroyers. Chrysler would take the multi-engine concept and run with it with their incarnation of the V30 857 multi-bank engine, which were adopted and utilized on the M4A3 Sherman. Even Caterpillar threw their hat into the ring, with their solution being a radial diesel engine, which was incorporated on the M4A5. Although all of these different engine platforms were submitted to the Army for trials and evaluation, they were all basically approved, and all of these platforms went into production. However, even though they were all in production at a certain extent, each one of them had some disadvantages to them, being extremely complicated to keep running in field, like the Chrysler Multibank, or with the different fuel source, which adds strain to logistics, like what we would see on the A2. However, one firm proposed an engine that was going to be one of the best all-around tank engines of World War II. And of course, that firm was the Ford Motor Company. Ford developed the V8 GAA gasoline engine. This engine basically fulfilled all of the needs for what was required for this vehicle. The engine was very powerful, it was extremely rugged, very reliable, and most importantly, it was extremely easy to work on for the maintenance crews. The engine was a gasoline engine, which may lead to some problems during combat, but by and large, these engines here were extremely efficient and were perfect for the job at hand. When Ford first developed this system and sent it to the military for evaluation, it received the designation M4A3 and the vehicles went into production. The original M4A3s, however, did not utilize the large hatch hull that we see on this vehicle here. The original A3s actually had a mosaic pattern type hull that was similar to the early M4 and M4A2s that came before it. It wasn't until 1944 was when the GAA was mated with the new large hatch hull that we have here, and that was when the true M4A3 was born. In combination of this engine power plant combined with this hull, the turret also received some modifications as well. The original Sherman turret only utilized one hatch for crew access, and that was the commander's cupola. In addition to that, there was a flaw with the original early pattern Sherman turret designs where the right-hand side of the cheek armor was slightly thinner compared to the other surfaces because of the equipment required in order to get access and operate the main gun. With feedback coming from the field, the engineers went ahead and made the necessary changes to the turret, making it a lot more improved compared to its early derivatives. The later turrets incorporated an oval loader's hatch, which gave fantastic crew access for exiting and entering inside the vehicle. The armor on the cheek section was built up with the turret casting, and the necessity of having a large welded slab added to that portion was no longer going to be required. These vehicles entered service with the U.S. military in 1944 and were entering combat from the early autumn period of 44 and saw action all the way up to the end of the war. Unlike the other versions of the Sherman where they were issued out as military aid to the British Commonwealth countries or to the other allied countries fighting with the US, the M4A3 was exclusively kept and used by the US military. Although the Ford Motor Company was the firm that developed the M4A3, it was the Fisher tank plant that actually did the hard production units. About 2,000 or 2,500 of these tanks were produced, and that's not including the other derivatives that were based upon this chassis. We have the M4A3 105, the M4A3 E2 Jumbo, and then eventually the M4A3 E8. That pattern of Sherman, of course, would keep this particular hull, but would be combined with the HVSS suspension and the 76mm T23 turret. Of course, this pattern of Sherman is universally regarded as the best evolution of this platform that was used by the US military. Starting with the model suspension, here you can see the VVS suspension now fully completed and what they look like with their final polishing. Like what was showcased earlier in the last video, the entire front portion of the VVSS were covered with cast texturing to better improve the look, giving them that realistic appearance which is typically found on these components on the real Shermans. Also, what was mounted, or I should say added, are these small mounting fastener holes which are found on these sections here on the front. There are 4 fastener location holes, and like I mentioned in the last video, these are found on the Shermans because on the casing that we have here, this was a reversible component where with one of these castings, you can use them for either side of the vehicle. The only thing that you swap out are the skid rail located on the top and the return roller bracket. Instead of mounting these on this portion over here for this side, if you're mounting it on the opposite side, you would simply just fasten these parts in the reverse direction. Because of that, you will always have holes found on these portions over here on the front faces. This, of course, is a mirror image on the opposite side of the vehicle as well. The VVS suspension is actually one of my favorite parts on this model. They are very nicely done and, in my opinion, are far superior to the ones found on the headlong counterpart. The headlong versions are usable, but these ones here, in my opinion, are better detailed. For instance, you have the 3 fasteners that are located on the bottom portion here of the bogie housings, and on the real vehicle, of course, these 3 fasteners would keep this plate in place and is actually what it's used to keep all the swing arm components where they need to be. The inner spring detailing is also a little bit better compared to the one on the headlong, and overall it's just a higher quality piece. Taigen, I believe, sells these as an aftermarket component where you can actually mount these on the headlong model, giving it the same detailing that we have here. From there, this now takes to the road wheels. The road wheels, like I mentioned before, are the late pattern dish style road wheels, and again, are nicely done out of the box. The pieces do have a real rubber tire on them, which give them fantastic detailing and are another advantage that these sets have over the other counterparts. If anyone is working on one of these models and want to change it up a bit, I believe there are aftermarket 3D printed road wheels that are available for the Taigen models that are a drop-in replacement that recycle the rubber tires. So you can have the different pattern of road wheels with the Taigen rubber tires on them, which on a Sherman, having the different pattern of road wheels intermix is a very common occurrence and something that is an easy way to really help your build. If you want to keep your build, however, all monotone with the type of wheels, that's also very appropriate too. And again, it just really depends on the type of look and feel you're going for. One thing about Shermans you'll come to know is that there are almost an infinite amount of choices and options available to you, and it's really left up to you, the builder's discretion, to see the look and feel that you're looking for your build. On the model here, to help break up the monotony a little bit, I went ahead and used a different shade of olive drab on some of the road wheels and just randomly intermixed them with the suspension set. This is another common trait that you'll see on infield vehicles, as these road wheels are commonly damaged, replaced, swapped out, and something like this is another good way to help give your model just a little bit more extra pop. For the road wheel weathering, you'll see that I went ahead and incorporated some oil streaks found on the bearings, which would be another common thing you would see on these vehicles. As they get driven, the bearings wear out and the seals start leaking some of the lubricants found. On that note, you can see, of course, the red painted Zerk fittings, common trait found on these Shermans, and it's one that is a very easy feature to do on your build. Since the pieces are molded in, all you gotta do, a little swipe of red paint, put a little dot on each, and you'll be good to go. Same thing is also found on the return rollers, of course. There's 2 on each side. Don't mix them with the larger holes that are found on the return rollers. Those are not the Zerk fittings. The Zerk fittings are these smaller ones. Also, one thing I want to point out is that the return rollers are not rubber rimmed. They are steel rimmed, so when you're weathering the unit, you want to have them in this polished type format that I have here. A common mistake that people make is they think these are rubber rimmed. They are not. They are indeed steel. Same thing is also done, by the way, on the rear idler wheel. The rear idler on the VVSS equipped Shermans is steel, not rubber rimmed like you would see on the HVSS. Another common mistake I've seen on many Sherman builds around. Just like with the return rollers, you can see I went ahead and added the polished paint job to these sections as well. Another weathering feature that I added to the rollers is the oil streaks found on these locations. Just like with the row wheels, this is something that would be a common occurrence found on these vehicles. And in 1/16 scale, adding this detailing is not only easier, but it's something that's also more appreciated because of the larger scale and size. Of course, along with the roller, the skid rail also has its polished paint job done up as well. Although I want to point out that because the tank is radio controlled, as the tank gets driven, these sections are going to polish naturally on their own, but it's just something that you could also add to your 1/16 or smaller scale builds in general. While on this side of the vehicle, I want to point out that now that the vehicle is fully painted and weathered, you can appreciate the bodywork that was done to these locations over here. As we recall from the last video, there are two fasteners that are found in these locations, which are used to mount the battery tray on the inside of the vehicle. It's a quirk found on the Taigen models and arguably hurts the look of the vehicle. But it's one that if you know how to do a little bit of bodywork, once you polish it away, it greatly improves the overall quality of the build. From there, this now takes to the track and the sprocket. Now, like I showcased in the last video, the stock Taigen kit gives you the rubber chevron rendition of the VVSS Sherman track. Unfortunately, although the overall size and quality of the piece look to be very good, they were not utilized on this build because of the material that the tracks were made in. Ironically, because the tracks are all made out of die-cast metal, it actually hurts the look because the tracks are replicating that of a rubber pattern of track. Of course, as the model gets driven, the paint's going to quickly wear off and you can have bare metal areas exposed, which would normally be sections of rubber. Because of this, this does hurt the look of the models and it's something that I just can't have on my tank. So in its place, I went ahead and replaced it with the tracks that we have here. These tracks are 3-bar cleat and they are from Mato. Personally, I always have an affection for these patterned track. They aesthetically look really cool, and because they are metal as the model gets driven, the bare sections of the metal are going to start popping out. Obviously, with the more the tank gets driven, the better the tracks overall will look. The tracks themselves are actually a fantastic quality, and I would argue are better than the Taigen ones. The Mato tracks are more like the real Sherman track, where it's comprising of 3 pieces. You have the pad and the 2 end connectors. The Taigen tracks, I believe they took a shortcut where they molded the teeth to the center pad, and that's how the units link together. The Mato, that's not the case. And one thing about the Mato track is that there are several options that are available, from different patterns of chevron to the 3-bar cleat, and you also even have renditions of all those with duckbills. So there are a lot of options available for you, the builder. Listed below in the video description, you will find a link directly to the Mato store where I purchased these track links from, and they ship worldwide. So if you're curious about the availability of these tracks, I had no problems procuring them, and I've purchased from them in the past before. I also want to point out that for the paintwork and weatherwork on the Mato tracks, this is actually something that is relatively easy. You see, the Mato tracks are actually, I believe, coated. I don't think they're parkerized, but they have some kind of a oxide finish on them, and it looks really good. So good, in fact, that I didn't paint the center portions of the track. The center portions you see here are this stock Mato coloring. I did dry brush some scratched metal on it, but other than that, what you see here on the center pads, that's what you get. What I did go ahead and paint, however, are the end connectors. I painted those on both sides with olive drab, as this is something that would be seen on several of the real vehicles that I've personally seen in the years of studying these things. Now, as nice as the track is, however, you do have to change one aspect to make it mate onto the Taigen tank. You see, the tracks do fit perfectly well, and you notice they go onto the running gear without any problems, but you are going to have a timing issue with the sprocket. The stock Taigen sprocket will not time with the Mato track, so when you change the track out, you're going to have to change out the sprocket as well. I did mention in the other video, in order to do this, you do have to make a slight modification to the sprocket itself, just basically enlarging the center hole, just so that the mounting fastener can fit from the sprocket into the gearbox. However, once this fastener is drilled out, the unit just installs without any problems. One concession on the sprocket, though, that you do have to basically live with is the overall shape. You see, the Mato sprocket has a bell shape to it, which is inaccurate for the Sherman. Oddly enough, the Taigen sprocket, in my opinion, detailing-wise, is the best sprocket on the 1/16 scale market, but again, unfortunately, it doesn't time with this track. So it's one of those teeter-totter things that you're gonna have to accept. Either keep the stock Taigen sprocket, but deal with the incorrect wear of the track, or have the appropriate wear or different pattern of track, but a slightly incorrect sprocket. Obviously, for my builds, I go with the latter. Moving our way to the rear idlers, the idlers on the vehicle are nicely done, but have one quirk to them, and that's you can't adjust the track tension. On the Taigen Sherman, there's no, now I'm not sure about if they change this, but on this variant here and on a couple of the other ones I've seen, there is no adjustable track tension on this system. So what you see is what you get. It's very similar to the Henlong in that regard. Now, during the build, I actually needed to remove the rear idler wheels just so I could get better access to the intersections here where I can prime and paint them. Not to mention do the other hull sponson work that I mentioned in the last video. Well, unfortunately, during the build process, I accidentally lost one of the spring clips that hold the units in place. You see, the way the idlers mount on this vehicle is that you have this plastic detailing here, which is just a detail cover face. Inside of there, you have a metal axle that's held in place with a spring clip. The spring clips are a good design feature. They will never pop off on you, but if you are working on the model, you have to be very careful on the addition or removal of these pieces, because they can easily fling off into Las Partia, and you're not going to be able to remount the idlers to the vehicle. And that's exactly what happened with me. I was able to take the idlers off without a problem, but during the reassembly, I was trying to fiddle, trying to get it in place, and boom, off it went. So I was basically screwed at that point, but luckily the spring clip size that's used on these Taigen models is a relatively easy one to find, and I was able to purchase a bag from Traxxas on eBay. Granted, now I had to buy another bit of equipment just to finish my build, so it was a little bit frustrating in that respect, but the positive side is that I have a ton of spring clips now, so in case I accidentally lose another one for whatever reason, I got spares, and it's always good to have spares on hand regardless. While down here, we can see the other details that I added to this section, namely the tow hitch mount, and the tow cable hookups. The tow hitch and tow hitch mount are stock with the kit. No mods really need to be discussed over there outside of some well beads, but the tow cable mounts, like I said in the last video, are new. The original ones are nicely molded in. Unfortunately, I had a mishap with the Dremel where it destroyed one of the units, and when that happened, I might as well just carterize everything and replace them. The units you see here are the resting ones from ECA, and they were just a direct drop-in replacement for the stock units. Of course, once they were added, the sculpted well beads were added just to blend everything in with the remainder of the lower hull work. While on the sponson here, you could see this little section that was added. This component here was absent on the stock Taigen model, but it's also missing on the Henlong version as well. The component is a resin addition from ECA, and it really fills in this area quite nicely. In addition to that, you could also see the Little Joe auxiliary generator exhaust manifold conduit that runs along most of the sponson and pops up here on the top. When it comes to this detailing, it does give you that nice little bit of detailing which is missing on all of these M4A3s, but one thing you have to keep aware of, if you're one of those type of people that like to really heavily drive your models off-road, perhaps one of these details here aren't really the best, because obviously as you drive on really rough terrain, a lot of debris and things like twigs and other sort of particularly are going to get kicked up here and are more than likely going to cause damage to that part. So it's one of those details where you want to be aware of what type of application you're going to be using your model. If you're going to be using your model as a scale detailed model that can, run, then one of these pieces here would be a good addition. But if you're one of those individuals that want to beat the hell out of your model and drive it, have fun, you know, like use it for rock crawling and stuff, perhaps this set here, not really to your needs. Moving our way to the front of the model, you can see the details now that the vehicle is fully completed. Of course, we have the rough cast texturing that was added and talked about in the last video. And you can see the little step rails found here on the front. Of course, Shermans have several options of these available, like everything else, from solid in-cast versions to the ones here which are more common on this pattern of Sherman, which would have been seal rods that were bent and welded in place at the factory. From here, you can see the tow cable lock as well as the comb device. These two are resting components from ECA. And right here, we have the front fender supports. There were some of this detailing that was integrally molded in, but I like to replace those with scratch build pieces just because they look a little bit better compared to if they were just integrally molded on. The integrally molded on ones were just amputated, and new ones were fastened out of steel strip that were soldered together, much along the same ways you see on my 1/6 scale counterparts. The units are are permanently affixed to the transmission cover, which gives you the illusion that they are actually connected to the front fenders, but that's just not the case. The only thing to watch out for with this type of method is that you do have some nice detailing with the setup, but you have to be very careful if you're taking the upper section on and off. You can easily pop these off if you put the upper hull on in a slightly askew manner. So this is one thing you have to watch out for. But again, like I mentioned before in the other video, because this tank does have a recharge jack in it, the need to take the upper off is only for an emergency. Moving along the sides, you can see the front weld detailing that we have on either side. This, of course, is going to be seen on this vehicle. And running along the bottom here, we have the side skirt rails. Side skirt rails are another really iconic bit of detailing found on the Shermans, and this is molded onto the stock kit. But like I said in the last video, they were very simplistic in their overall shape, and one common way to improve the look of your build is just to straight up amputate them. You just sand them thoroughly flush, and once gone, you can replace them with Plastruct strip. The strip looks much better in my opinion because you do have the scale thickness to them, and also with the rails, they are mounted slightly too high on the stock units, and this of course is done by design because of the way the molds are. By molding them into the top upper hull here, they are stronger. You don't have to worry about them breaking or flinging off on you, but visually they are a little bit on the chunkier end. With these ones here, I purposely mounted them slightly lower past the sponson, which is correct for this vehicle, and I went ahead and drilled out the mounting holes for the side skirt mounts. Again, it's a nice way to really give your model a little bit of detailing. They are in 3 sections, which would be seen on the real vehicle. We have a section here in the front, a smaller section here in the rear, and then the longest section is right here towards the center. Now, a good compromise, if you don't want to remove these sections, you can actually add faux detailing like this on the molded in ones. In fact, it's something I do on my 135s. All you got to do is with a X-Acto saw, you just make the little slit lines on the front and the rear. With a pin vise or with a Dremel, you can drill out these holes. You don't want to go all the way through, of course. This little dimple should do it. And then with some sculpted weld beads, you can go ahead and just add the little spot welds that complete the look of this component. Another thing I want to point out is that the sections here on the front and rear are not straight, and they have a little angle downward. That's another thing to point out because the stock ones are just a parallel piece that go directly through the entire upper hull. Real Sherman, however, they would have an angle right here and right here. It's another one of those little Sherman things that you can easily miss on your build. For the welds, like I said before, they are in this type of configuration where they're just spot welds, little beads going, staggering on the top portion of the rail. And again, it's one of those bits of detailing that when you do them and you add them to your build, it really makes the build just shine and pop compared to just having the piece just weldless. Of course, needless to say, mirror image on the opposite side of this model. This now leads us to the rear fender mounts. Now, on the Sherman family, the fender mounts are a piece of angle iron which are welded to the rear plate. On the model here, the best way to replicate this is well with a piece of Plastruct angle. You just glue it directly to the side, and then you could sculpt some weld beads on top which serve to give you that nice bit of detailing, but also give you some more structure and support and really do help the parts stick to the model in a more secure manner. There are 3 holes found on these sections over here. And one thing I want to point out is that and when I frequently point out in these Sherman videos, if you're doing this detailing, a common mistake is that you have the piece run directly to the wall, and that's just not the case. On the Sherman, they have this little gap found on both sides. The gap is for the Little Joe auxiliary generator exhaust stack to poke its head through in this section over here. However, even though it's only found on one side, the gap is still present on both sides of the vehicle as it's symmetrical with each other. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Moving up takes us to the spare track racks. These ones here are the stock Taigen units, and we're basically left as is. What I did add, however, was a little hinge detailing found in these 2 sections, and I added the little wing nut details which are found on these 2 areas here. On the real vehicle, you undo these wing nuts, and these 2 straps would actually hinge downward and would allow you to remove the track links. Oddly enough, the Mato kit actually has this, and I believe they have it in a functional format. So that's one thing to keep in mind if you're looking to add a little bit extra detailing functionality to your Sherman build. And from the track racks, this now brings us to the center bit of detailing here, which is probably my favorite bit of detailing on this entire build, and that's the rear storage rack. Now, like I said earlier in the last video, the storage rack found on the model is very simplistic in its overall shape and detailing, and it's really nothing more than a scaled up variant from the Tamiya 1/35 scale M4A3 Sherman Tank kit. However, the component that we have here is a replacement piece from ECA. Like I may have said in the last video, the ECA component is made from HD 3D printed material and is literally nothing more than a scaled down variant of my 1/6 scale 3D printed M4A3 Sherman rear storage rack. Although on that unit, it's made from the standard white material and it's made to be fully functional, in 1/16 scale, the HD material is used in its place. However, the file is exactly the same and has all of the same details and features found on it. This set here has been on the catalog now for a little while. However, this is the first time that I've personally been able to use it on one of my own 1/16 scale builds. I may have also pointed out in the last video that I have 2 renditions of this set that are offered. This one here is the unit that is rendered in the deployed state and is static. It is non-functional in that it doesn't fold up, but it does hinge upward like we have here. However, the other unit is fully functional, and it is, again, just my large one, just miniaturized to 1/16. That one, I've actually sold quite a few of, and I just want to say congratulations to anyone who purchased that piece, because you are indeed a braver man than me. Not that the unit is impossible to assemble or anything, it's just that trying to get these very small, very frail pieces to fully function is doable, but is that something that I personally want to do? Not so much. But hey, you know what? Both options are available for you, the builder, and it depends just how crazy you are with your builds. If you want to have it with the piece either folded up or have the ability to do so, rock on. Or if you just want to be pragmatic like I am and just have the unit displayed in its open state, you can have that option as well. Now, the unit, like I said, is fully detailed and does have the missing details that are just not found on the Tamiya set. Namely, the little grab handles, or I should say the little tie downs that we have on these locations here. The locking arms are fully rendered with their stops and fastener details present. The top portion here, we have the correct amount of fasteners, which is 4 per hinge. We have the weld bead detailing, we have the hinge detailing, and we also have here the wing nut detailing, which on the real unit is how these sets are actually fastened in the closed state. You would fold this guy up, and these wing nuts here would lock into these 2 little recesses found on either end. Once you tie down the wing nut, the piece is held in its closed state and won't flop open on you during motion. On a similar note, on the bottom we have these two little bent sections on either side. These two are for other wing nuts that would be mounted to the rear of the hull and would swing open and tighten down, and that would prevent this portion here from flopping around like this when the tank is in operation. Now on this model here, I do not have that wing nut detailing present. However, this is something I can see myself tooling up on versions of this set from here on forth, but that remains to be seen. More than likely when I do another Sherman, I'll probably talk about that. While on the bottom portion, you can see it has the stop that is integrally printed on. This is absent, of course, on the Tamiya piece. And we have the gun cleaning stave mounts fully rendered. They have their interior detailing as well. Again, if it's on the big one, it's going to be on the little one. This piece here is a separate component that can be made to hinge open. On this one here, I just permanently glued it in the closed state, just to keep everything where it needs to be. The gun cleaning staves are not included with the set. These are scratch built for this model and are actually made out of real wooden rods. They are made from kebab sticks and were just trimmed to the appropriate lengths. For the end connectors, these are made from heat shrink tubing, and I just basically slide it on and I heat the ends with the heat gun, which constrict onto the wooden dowel, and the part that sticks out of the wooden dowel constricts even further, which mimics pretty well the end connectors. Now, because the units are non-functional, they're just for looks and are made just to be mounted in this retracted state that I have here, I didn't have to tool up the actual end connectors and have them be fully functional. The other advantage about the shrink tubing is that they plug perfectly into the stave mounts that are integrally printed into these two sections without any problems. On the other end that we have here, we have the swab. The swab is made from two pieces. I kept the top portion, which was integrally molded into the plastic piece that's found on the stock kit, but I also went ahead and replaced the bristle section with a section of pipe cleaner. This really gives it some fantastic detailing and makes it just pop compared to the stock original unit. Aside from the folding rack, the crank handle here, stock original unit, kept as is, as are the majority of the tools. And in fact, all of the tools here are the stock ones, and I just basically recycled them. Of course, during the rebuild process, these were originally glued to the top deck, and so I had to carefully amputate these off with a Dremel Multimaster and a very sharp X-Acto knife, and with a little bit of patience, I was able to pop them all off, do the body work in these sections over here, because you are going to have some remnants of the glue and possibly some sections of the plastic that are remaining. These were all sanded flush, sanded smooth, and from there I was able to then recycle and reuse the tools after the painting process was done. For the tools themselves, just like on all of these American tanks, the metal straps are painted to represent metal, but the straps that secure the things to the actual tank are made from canvas or leather. When you're building any American tank, keep this in mind, and generally these pieces are actually integrally molded in, but a lot of people don't either know what they are or don't know how to replicate them. All you gotta do is, on the metal components, just paint them the same color as the tank and have the camouflage pattern. Of course, you want to patch that into it, weather it accordingly as well. But for the straps, like on the shovel here, it would be this one over here, on the axe would be here, and on the pickaxe, that would be this one here in the center. The one in the rear would be metal, and this would be this belt that would hold it on. On this model, I went with a webbing type material, as this was used for straps on these vehicles, but again, leather belts were used as well. If you're gonna go with the webbing, do some kind of a khaki or an olive drab. If you're gonna go for a leather belt, of course, go with something like a darker brown of sorts. Back to the rear, this takes us to the rear taillights. Now, the rear taillights on this model here have been improved from the stock original. The stock original taillights are one of the weaker points on these RTR models, and it's actually the same type of thing that you will encounter on the Henlong model as well. The way they're rendered is you have an LED and then you have the plastic casing, which gives you the basic overall shape of the American AFV taillight, but it does leave some room for improvement. Basically, the cat eye face is completely absent on the piece. It's there molded in, but you have this obtrusive LED which protrudes from the center. It really does hurt the look of it, but luckily it's able to be readily fixed. Listed below in the video description is a link to a Shapeways store where the individual sells a drop-in set for LEDs, which gives you the cat's eye detailing on both the left and the right-hand variant of the taillight. This is important because on American tanks, this unit here on the right-hand side is blacked out, and the pattern found on the stamping is slightly different compared to the one with the straight-up cat's eye. The unit, like I said before, or like I may have said in the last video, but I definitely mentioned my other 1/16 videos, the sets are very nicely done. However, you do have to do some modifications to them because out of the box, they are not suitable for a World War II Sherman tank. Instead, they are made for a Henlong Walker Bulldog. Why this is important is because the Walker Bulldog utilized a post-cast aluminum pattern of taillight cat's eye. The face is identical, but the difference is the endpoints. On the World War II ones, they were stamped steel and they basically clamshelled over the base housing, while on the post-war ones, cast aluminum, and they've screwed to it. Because of that, they have these little flanges that protrude out from the edges. His units are very nice, but they can be turned into the World War II counterparts fairly easy. All you gotta do is with some sandpaper, you just gotta polish away the details of these nubs. Once they are polished away, you now effectively have the World War II pattern of taillight. Also, like I may have shown in the other video, you don't use the entire rear cup portion of the taillight in order to affix to the Henlong, or in this case the Taigen model. All you need is just the front portion of it, so the rear section you basically just trim away. Once you have the unit amputated, it just glues directly to the housing like we have here. Also on the taillight, we can see this little section that emerges from the back. This is found on the real vehicles, and this is how the unit actually fixed to the tank. This is absent on the stock Taigen units, as they're just two wires, or I should say the leads that come out for the LED. In order to replicate this detail, all you gotta do is with a blade of Plastruct, you just shove it in between the two sections of the wire. This gives you the effective look of the detailing, and it doesn't inhibit in any way, shape, or form the effectiveness of the LED. Once everything is painted, it just blends right in and you don't really notice it. If you look carefully though, however, you could probably see the lead emerging here from the surface, but it just blends in with the remainder of the detailing found on the piece. Moving along takes to the grab handles here on the rear engine deck. You notice that these are in the retracted state. On the M4A3 Sherman, this is also true for several other variants of the Sherman, the handles were retractable. This was to prevent anyone from, getting their foot caught in this and taking a header off of the rear engine deck, which probably ruin your day. On the model here, they are integrally molded in, but to better improve the look, the molded in ones were amputated and wire ones were added in place. Now, usually on my models, I tend to render them in the pulled up manner, but for this one here, I went with the opposite way and had them in their retracted state. Either way is applicable and is appropriate. It just depends on which way you want to go. Technically speaking, however, this way would be more accurate because the piece is kind of weighed down, so when you pick it up, and if you're not using it, it generally drops down in place. But if there's a little rust or corrosion on it, they can easily stick up in the upward position. So it's not necessarily inaccuracy if you render it in that format. While on the handles, it takes us here to the engine hatch grading grills, and these, of course, new additions. The original ones were blades that were molded in. Those were cut away and new wire ones added. Simple way to improve the look of your build. Progressing further, takes us to the detailing here on the side. We have the EastCoastArmory.com Resin tow cable mount. I already mentioned the one in the front, and the Sherman does utilize two. One on the transmission cover, one here on the tail. Very simple, very quick. Some people get this confused and they purchase more than two for their vehicle, but these are sold in a set, so one set is all you need to equip one vehicle. Here we have the engine hatch stop. This is a common bit of detailing found on the A3. Obviously, if this thing swings open, you need this to stop the hinge from over swinging. And here we have the lift rings. These are not the kit original ones. The kit ones are adequate in their overall detailing, but since I had these 3D printed ones left over from another build, I might as well incorporate them on this tank, and it's a good thing I did because they are highly recommended. The pieces are very nicely detailed. They do have their appropriate shape to them. They have their weld beads to them. They're just great in basically any way, shape, or form. The link to them is found in the video description listed below. Moving along, you can see here the tow cable cleats, which once the tow cable would be fitted would help contour and keep it in this position here and prevent it from flopping around. These are the resin pieces found on the ECA catalog, and again, were utilized just as is. Back here, you can see the other mods that were made, namely the drainage holes. These are absent on the kit, but are a staple found on these Sherman tanks, and of course helps prevent any water which would accumulate in these sections over here from puddling up, and it's a nice little convenient, drainage spout. You'll notice that on this model, I went ahead and weathered them with the leaky oil type stains, which would be found and would be a common sight to see on these real vehicles. If anyone has ever fueled up some heavy machinery using a funnel, you're going to get that fuel like everywhere. So of course the fuel would drip out, get dirty, and leave these streaks that we have here on the sides. Now on the Sherman, specifically the A3, both of these sections here are for the main fuel cells. The one in the center is for the radiator fluid, and the one right here in the corner is for the Little Joe auxiliary generator. So this one would be a premix type fuel, and these two would be for gasoline. You can see some more of the weathering now that I position the vehicle better on camera. Obviously the one for the radiator fluid doesn't really get the oil streaks as you would see on the ones for the actual fuel. All of the fuel caps have been replaced from the stock original. The original ones were molded in and were adequately detailed. However, I needed to make the unit fully functional. I believe I touched upon this in the other video, but this fuel cap here can actually be removed in order for me to get access to the fuel or the refill system for the smoke fluid. So basically this guy here just slides out. It's hard to do it on camera here. I'll touch upon this in part 3 of the video when I go over the functions, but basically this guy here unplugs. You can then put your filler spout here, top off the smoke system, plug it up, and you're good to go. This is a system I've utilized on basically all the 116 Shermans that I've done so far. But because I had to replace this filler cap, I might as well replace the others to keep the continuity. Here we have the fire extinguisher handle box. This is another ECA edition and is better detailed from the stock original one, which again, more than likely is just a copy from the old vintage Tamiya kit. Here you can see, of course, I paint the handles in red, which is a staple found on these vehicles. While here you can see again all of the weld beads, and the weld beads were added to all surfaces of the vehicle from the lower hull, but it's definitely more appreciated here up on the top. Taking our way to the front section, here you can see the bow area, and you'll notice the rough cast texturing that I added to these sections as well. Like I said in the other video, these two sections here on the A3, on the late production A3 specifically, was a cast unit, and basically all the plates would then attach and weld in this format. The texturing was added to greatly help improve the look because it was left totally smooth on the stock kit, but the stock kit does give you the bulbous look to it, which again is lifted directly from the Tamiya. While on the front, takes us to the bow hatches. Like I said in the other video, the bow hatches are non-functional, as are most of the hatches on this vehicle. The only hatch that is fully functional is the cupola. Everything else is molded solid. Probably one of the weaker aspects on these 1/16 scale Taigens, but this is also true for the Henlong as well. Can't really speak on the Mato though. Hopefully at some point in time they'll revise this, make them work. If they do, it'll make access to the inside a lot easier. But until then, this is the best you're going to get. So the hatches have their grab handles replaced with metal wire, and here we have the brush guards, which again are the HD 3D printed ones from shapeways.com. I've utilized these on several builds in the past. Detail wise, they are absolutely stellar. They are awesome. Problem is they are on the frail end, and you have to be very careful if you incorporate these on any of your builds. Fortunately, with me, I do have the recharge jack located on the bottom of the tank, so I have to pay massive attention to make sure none of these get snagged, because these are the type of parts that will get snagged. They just ask for it, and you have to be careful. And you also have to be careful, honestly, when you're driving the tank. If you're going off-road, you're the type of the guy, like I said before, likes to drive through brush and bushes, maybe these pieces you should not install if that's going to be the type of running that you're going to be doing. Moving our way to the Travelock stock unit, like I said before, the only addition I made was to the eyelet, which, like again, on the real vehicles, used to lock and open the little barrel clamps that we have here on either end. From there, it takes us to the brush guards. All three of these are stock with the model. The only modification I made, of course, was to the little canisters found on the ends. common detail found on Shermans. Most people tend to miss. If you add it, it helps look at the build. This model here, like I frequently use, I replicated these out of a piece of shrink tubing. For the siren, the vehicle does supply you with a siren, but it is the solid type, like again, lifted off of a Tamiya. So in its place, I had again the football pattern of American siren, which was found on the same 3D printed runner set that I got the grab handles from. Just like the ones in the back, the ones in the rear were also swapped out with the same ones from the set for the same reasons that I just mentioned. Right behind it, here and here, we have scratch built side view mirror mounts. Just a little bit of metal strip with a hole drilled through it, completes this detailing. Nice bit of detailing. It's actually one I like to do on my larger scale builds where I actually have the side view mirrors, but 1/16, a little problematic to try to make in this scale, so just the mounts would be fine. Realistically, these would be kept inside. Obviously, they would get smashed up pretty quickly if left on the outside, specifically in combat. So, but have the mounts fitted, improves the look of your build. Moving further takes to the BAO M1919A4. Now, like I showed in the last video, the stock unit was leaving a lot of room to be desired. In fact, the whole barrel was one of the weaker points on the model. The ABER set is highly recommended, if not arguably mandatory, for anyone who's doing a rebuild on one of these models. It's a sheer easy way to really make the model look a hell of a lot better than it did stock. Also, like I showed in the other video, the stock barrel needs to be modified slightly in order to make it properly fit inside of the Taigen machine gun ball mount. But now that the unit's fully assembled, you can see what it looks like mounted and painted, as well as weathered. And like I said before, it is a focal point found on the bow portion of the Sherman. And this now leads us to the turret. Turret, of course, is the stock unit, and like I said before, was permanently attached to each other via the fasteners, and the fasteners are thoroughly blended in and are no longer visible. The cast texturing was reapplied to the turret surface in order to have everything blend in and also have that appropriate look to it, which is what one would expect to see on a Sherman turret casting. Starting here with the back takes us to the 50 caliber storage equipment. Of course, anyone will tell you when the machine gun is not being fitted right here on the main gun mount, this would actually hinge downward and the gun would be fastened in this location here. The barrel would be removed from the receiver, mounted to these two clamps, and the receiver, the cradle would lock into this section over here in the storage panel, and the receiver barrel sleeve would go right here and would be clamped directly in place. Now, obviously, this is a bit different from the stock original unit. That's because it has been improved. The original components for basically all these pieces were not utilized other than the support arms that emerge here from the bustle. Those were kept, but all the other details were replaced. The storage panel here is the resin set from ECA. I've utilized this on several of the other builds in the past, and it always improves the look of the model compared to the chunky box casting that is present with the kit. Also, you notice it is not in a straight line, and it is slightly at an angle, which is what you would expect to see on the real vehicle. Stock one just emerges directly straight outward, as it does again, you guessed it, from the stock 1/35 scale Tamiya kit. On the barrel shroud clamp mechanism here, this is a replacement. The original one is supplied with a kit. It does have some pretty decent detailing on it, but I wanted to improve this piece further from the stock unit. So in its place, I tooled up a brand new component from HD 3D Print. The unit here is a new addition to the EastCoastArmory.com product line and consists of both this section as well as the barrel clamps. Both pieces are made again out of HD 3D Print and have all of their appropriate detailing found on them, including the weld beads. They have their appropriate geometry to it, and most importantly, you'll notice that this unit here is fully functional. Let me bring the camera in closer so you get a better idea of what it looks like. With the camera up close, you can see that the piece is fully hinged, and you'll notice that it has the openings on the top portion here, which are found on the real unit, and the purpose of these are, this is the section where the T-handle here would clamp onto. If you also notice, the T-handle is fully pivotable. just like it is on the real unit. Now this component here is actually also offered in 1/6 scale. In fact, I started making it in 1/6 and I scaled it down to the 1/16 set. Both sets are found on the eastcoastarmory.com catalogs in their respective catalog pages. On the barrel clamps themselves, you'll notice that they have their detailing present as well. The barrel clamp features its guard, which is right here on the lower portion, and then we have the rabbit ears clamp mount, which are found riveted to the bottom base, and the rivet heads are present on the printing as well. This piece here is an instant way to improve your 1/16 scale model, being a Sherman, Pershing, or whatever. Another thing I want to point out is that in addition to the pieces being very frail, we generally tend to work on more than one American tank, be it from Shermans to Pershings to what have you. Well, I factored this in, so on these sets, they consist of parts not just for one vehicle, but for 5. You have enough barrel clamps and the receiver clamps on hand to equip 5 American tanks. So again, this is great to keep on hand in case you accidentally break one of these pieces for whatever reason. You know, after all, stuff does happen. Or if you're careful enough, if you have a whole bunch of these vehicles on hand, be it Headlongs or Taigens, Shermans, Pershings, you need to equip them. You have the components ready to do so. I also wanted to give a sneak peek that if anyone has the 76 T23 version of the Taigen kit, guess what? I got you covered because I'm currently finishing off the files to create that set as well. And of course, just like with this one, there's going to be enough for 5 vehicles. Before I leave this section here, I also want to point out that if you do not want 5 sets for whatever reason, want to save a little bit of money, I actually will be selling them individually as well. But again, these are all going to be listed in more depth with their prices on the ECA catalog. Moving from the 50 caliber storage equipment, the remainder of the details on the side of the turret are stock with the Taigen model. Side lift rings, shell ejection port, and of course the lift ring is a mirror image on the opposite side. I do want to point out that during construction I kind of had to figure out where these details went, because once the turret got its cast texturing on it, the locations that were molded into where you stick these components were caked over with the texturing, so I had to basically find the hole on the turret. But after a little bit of math and tinkering, I was able to track these sections down and get the lift rings mounted on correctly. On this portion here, you can see the smoke grenade mortar. That's stock with the kit. I just went ahead and airbrushed it with a little bit of weathering on it, as it would get some powder fouling if the units are ever discharged. Moving up takes to the turret roof detailing, and this is standard M4A3. Starting with probably the coolest bit of equipment found on any American tank, it's one of my favorites, is the MP48 spring antenna base. Of course, this is the ECA unit, and it's awesome because I get to do this. Of course, the spring works, and of course, I chipped some paint, but you know what, I'll touch that up later. It's totally worth it playing with these things. With that out of the way, you can see how the units are painted. The remainder of the unit is supposed to be olive drab, but the center portion here where the insulator is painted with its amber coloring, which is what you would find on this unit. A lot of people who build these models in any scale tend to overlook this, and it's one of those facepalm moments because it is one of the easiest things to paint on your model, and it definitely makes it just look so much better if you paint that damn insulator. So paint your insulators. The remainder of the antenna wire is also painted. We have here the knurl tip on the bottom and on the top. In 1/16 scale, you're not going to see the knurlings, but the detailing is still there. On the top, you'll notice it's painted in red. The bottom is blue. This is directly off of a real MP48 spring antenna base wire that I've seen hooked up on a real military vehicle. Over here on the rear portion of the antenna well, you notice I drilled out the drainage hole, which would be found on the real Sherman casting, because obviously you can imagine this filling up with water pretty quickly, and that's something that's less than ideal. The holes are found on all of the Shermans, be it the high bustle, low bustle. All of these round 75mm turrets, they have that drainage hole. So just add that with a Dremel. It's one of those little things that help the build. And now leads us to the secondary antenna base mount. And yes, this is a secondary antenna base mount. No, this is not a machine gun mount. I have to point this out because there are, in current year, there are still people that mis-ID this piece, and it's really annoying when I see that. If I see that, congratulations, you screwed up your Sherman and you deserve to be ashamed. So this is actually for the secondary antenna base mount. Most of the time, a secondary radio is not mounted onto the vehicle, so it's just plated over the way you see it here. However, there's still this small little hole found on the rear portion of the mount. Simple addition to make. When you do the, well, for this one, drill this one out too, and your build will thank you for it. From the antenna equipment, this now brings us to the folding 50 caliber pintle mount. Because this unit does have the late commander's cupola, the pintle mount would be this pattern that we have here, and like I said before, when not in use, would actually be stowed in the retracted position. This one here is the EastCoastArmory.com unit. It is molded solid, unlike the 1/6 scale one, which can actually work. On this model here, the kit does supply you with one of these units, but I just dropped the ECA one in its place because it does have better detailing compared to the stock counterpart. Now, normally it would have an M2 HB 50 caliber machine gun mounted to this location. Unfortunately, on this model here, I don't have one fitted because I am waiting for my cradle to get back from the 3D printer. Once it comes in, I'll just drop a 3D printed M2 on it and call it a day. So unfortunately, it's not going to be seen in this video series, but don't be surprised if you see this tank turn up in another video down the road. I assure you, by that time, it will have the proper M2 HB fitted. So with that out of the way, let's continue on with the remainder of the turret details. From the machine gun mount takes us to the commander's cupola, and this model here, like I said before, utilizes the late pattern panoramic view cupola. Now, the unit itself is nicely detailed and is the only hatch, like I said before, that is fully functional. However, one thing to point out is that the hatch itself is, and the cupola ring itself, is all made from die-cast metal, and it is nicely detailed. The ring itself is integrally molded to the turret, and in order to make them look like that they're not, I went ahead and carved into the side of the turret here this little seam line. This seam line here gives the illusion that the commander's cupola is a separate component compared to the turret, which again, it would be on the real vehicle. Another thing to point out for anyone who is looking to upgrade their model fully, you can replace this set with the earlier, or I should say the earlier pattern split hatch cupola, which would be found on a mid-production M4A3 like this. But unfortunately, this will require a lot more work because you will have to amputate and delete the cupola. It's doable, but because it is made out of die-cast metal and is integrally molded to the turret, it is going to be a bitch trying to remove all this material in order to make it flush. Again, it's doable, but you're going to have to work for that one. Other than that, the detailing on it, again, like I said, nicely done. The only addition that I made to it detail-wise was the addition of the hatch stop, or I should say the hatch opening clip that I have here, and the clip receptacle. This piece here is made out of a piece of plastruct and was added, and this one here is a resin casting that I have from a few of my other sets. I believe my Israeli M50 set comes with this piece, so I just reused it for this build. While on that note, you can see on the loader's hatch here, turn this guy around, there's another one of these clips found right here in this portion of the turret, and of course on the real vehicle, when the hatch would open, it would clip into this section here and prevent the hatch from falling down if the tank is in operation. While on the hatches, the handles that you see here are replacements. The original ones were integrally molded to both of these sections. Like I said before, it hurts to look at the build, so I just cut them off and replace them with bent metal wire. From the hatches now brings us to the panoramic periscopes back on the cupola. Now, if you notice, the way I painted them is my typical configuration, where I only paint the center oval here because that's where the lens would be. Obviously, you don't want to get it onto these little bumps here because on the real vehicle, those are the mounting fasteners for the frame. You don't want to do that. Now, while on this note, a common question I get on my builds is they ask, John, what color do you use to paint your periscopes and your prisms? Do you use blue? Do you use green, red? How do you do it? Well, in terms of painting them red, that's only the case if you're building an M1. If you're building an M1, that's really where it's relevant to painting them red, or possibly even a modern version of the Bradley. A lot of builders out there like to paint them either blue or green. I've even seen silver, but mostly blue and green. In my opinion, they just don't look like that in real life. I've climbed aboard several real tanks before, from an M4A3 to a few Shermans, and I can tell you for a fact, when you see these things in person, the periscopes are really black in coloring. You just don't really get to see on the inside. The only time where this isn't really the case is if the hatches are open or if someone has the lights on the inside. If that's not the case, you're really just going to see them blacked out like the way you see it here. So on all of my builds, you'll notice I paint the prisms gloss black. From the prisms, this now leads us to the remainder of the turret equipment, which first takes us to the periscope with the brush guard here. This is the same unit that I mentioned before on the two bow hatches. I just simply dropped this one in place. The original equipment was deleted, allowing me to then add this replacement detailing. From there, it takes us to the searchlight. The searchlight is the HD 3D printed unit, and I've utilized these sets in the past, and they are awesome. Highly recommended. Their detailing on them are sublime, and they are worth every penny. The link to purchase these pieces are listed below in the video description and are another component found on shapeways.com. This now leads us to the last two bits of detailing that were added. Here we have the 50 caliber travel lock, and here we have the vane sight. Both of these components are new additions to the EastCoastArmory.com product line, and just like with the other parts I mentioned, are made out of HD 3D print. The travel locks are offered in two different options. We have the unit represented like this way here, which is in the retracted state, and the other pattern is with the unit in its deployed state where it's sticking upward. The units themselves are non-functional, but they do have all of their detailing represented on them. Note the correct shape geometry for the bottom base. We have here the locking fasteners, or I should say the securing fasteners. The locking pivoting block is present. The swinging arm does have its appropriate geometry and detailing to it, and the barrel clamp mechanism has the same detailing found on the ones that I mentioned before, with the correct shape as well as their rivet detailing, which is found on both ends. You'll also see that the weld beads are integrally printed to this component as well, and it's literally just a drop-in installation to any American vehicle that utilizes this bit of equipment. Just like with the other components that I just mentioned in the back, these travel locks here, both options are sold in a pack of 5. So with one set, you can equip 5 US vehicles. Along with the travel lock, the vane sight is the exact same story. With one set, you have enough to equip 5 Sherman tanks. Specifically, this is the Sherman tank variant, namely the one for the 75mm turret. The difference, of course, being is that the 75 has this riser that we have here, which lifts the vane sight off of the turret's base. The vane sight and the elevator are integrally printed to each other, so it's a drop-in installation as well. The component does have all of its detailing on it, including the mounting fasteners, which are present on both sides for thorough detailing, and you also have the correct geometry of the front blade that we have here. Note the way it tapers in on either side. We have the hooded front sight, kind of like a rifle, and you can see the post found directly in the center. On the back portion, we have the 3 holes. The top portion of the hooded vane as its notch cut in, and if I spin around to the back, you can see that the back portion is hollowed out exactly as it would be on the real vehicle. Now, like I said with the 50 caliber storage equipment, there is another version of this vane sight that is currently available right now for sale on the ECA catalog, where it is off of the riser. That version is better suited for vehicles like the M26 Pershing or the 76mm version of the Sherman turret. Moving along takes us to the mantlet. Nothing really much to talk about here. The stock component is very nicely detailed and was basically kept as is. The only addition I made was to the section over here where I added the barrel tip of the M1919 machine gun. This detailing would be found in this type of configuration on the real vehicle, but is absent on the stock Taigen model. Now, I have seen a few builds out there where they get overzealous with the barrel length and they tend to have the entire barrel shroud sticking out to this much. it's not an M3 leaf, folks. On the Sherman, that wouldn't be the case, just with the way the internal mechanism is and the mount. You're not going to have more than just a tip sticking out of the mantlet. The tip itself is a resin casting that I developed. However, I may or may not add this to the catalog, as I'm really in the process of phasing out my resin castings for 3D print. But this might be something I might offer for a limited time. The piece here is dremeled out thoroughly so that the flash of the LED on the inside can still protrude from the barrel tip. And this now takes to the paint and the markings. For the model's camouflage pattern, I went with a late ETO camouflage scheme, which would be appropriate for a Sherman of this pattern. This type of camouflage pattern would be seen on vehicles from late 1944 all the way up to the end of the war in 1945. So really from around Operation Cobra and onward. Basically, if anyone has seen the movie Fury, vehicles from that era would be generally seen in this type of a configuration. For the shade of olive drab, I went with my tried and true formula for the tint that you see here, which is used from vehicles I like to represent from mid to late World War II. The shade is my own custom mix and is not something that you can purchase in store. For the black bands, this is just straight up flat black that was airbrushed over the OD. However, this vehicle should look a little bit different compared to the other models I've built in the past, because unlike those ones, this vehicle here, I played around with a few filters. So there's a few shades going on here from a light tan color to even a little bit of yellow. there's a bit of chemistry going on in here in order to get the tank to look to this condition. Hopefully it comes out in screen, but the tint is definitely noticeable when you see these models in person, specifically when you compare and contrast it to the other vehicles that I've built in the past. From the camo, this takes us to the markings. Now, the markings on this model here are only done with dry transfers. No water slide decals were utilized for this build. The dry transfers are from Archer, and they can be found via the links listed below in the video description. I've utilized the Archer dry transfers on a few other builds in the past, and they are highly recommended. I am really a big fan of dry transfer over water slides. Water slide decals are okay, but they just look so much better in my opinion with dry transfers. You don't have to do the lacquering or any of the other type of tricks that are required in order to secure water slides in place, nor do you have the risk of worrying about any sort of silvering. And the dry transfers go on perfectly to flat surfaces like the ones here on the side, and they even bonded extremely well with the textured surfaces here found on the turret and also on the front transmission cover. The Archer sets, in addition to the stars, I was also able to pick up some just USA bumper numbers, where you basically compile your own bumper code. And the one here on this model is totally fictional, so if you're trying to find out which vehicle I used, you're going to be SOL. The markings I want to point out, the stars do come in some very large sizes, which is great for 1/16, but the bumper codes are only for 1/35. Having said that, however, one thing I've noticed on several of the builds is that I've utilized 1/35 scale markings for things like bumper codes in the past, and they actually do work pretty well in 1/35. Even though they are a little bit on the smaller end, these bumper codes were in a multitude of different sizes, so using 1/35 markings for this type of application is acceptable in my opinion. You can see exactly how well they worked. They transferred on absolutely perfectly, and again, these sets are highly recommended. If Archer is watching this video right now, I strongly recommend, bro, make one dedicated 1/16 scale markings for bumper codes. He does have 1/16 scale markings listed on his catalog, however, they are exclusively for the M26 Pershing, which I've used in the past and are highly recommended, by the way. But if one recommendation I want to make just a generic number bumper code set for 1/16 scale American vehicles. Trust me, they will be greatly appreciated. And that finishes off the detail aspect of this build. The only thing left to do now is to take the model outside, to take it for a test run and really put it through its paces. But that's going to be discussed in the third installment of this video series. And with that, that wraps up part 2 of this 3-part video series on this 1/16 scale radio-controlled M4A3 Sherman tank. If you like this video, stay tuned for part 3 of this video series, which should hopefully be listed shortly after this video here gets posted. And if you already haven't done so, don't forget to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being 1/16 and 1/35 scale model showcase videos, along with the larger 1/6 scale project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that frequently get posted to this channel. Finally, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/16 and 1/6 scale builds and detail components. Thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you in part 3.